I'm kind of thinking about this more as a show and tell in terms of showing and telling about a lot of what I've gathered, because there is a bit of, for me, a delay or a duration between gathering ideas and gathering things and thinking about things and when I want to make an argument. So this is sort of this interlude between gathering and making an argument, and so hopefully our discussion can sort of shape things up. I also like to sort of give some context on how I sort of think about learning process and how I deliver information. One of my favorite authors, Clarice Lispector, who wrote Agua Viva in 1973. This comes from the 2012 translation. She writes, "I want to write to you like someone learning." And I always like to say, I want to speak to you like someone learning. In the previous presentation, there was a comment on literature and reading being a process of misrecognition and mistakes and gaps and voids. And I'm really interested in thinking about a presentation not as sort of a monarchical articulation of an idea, but as a space for me to learn and unlearn. We've been making lots of analogies over the last 3 days. This comes from a work that I did in 2018, where I was spending a lot of time working with autocorrects and collocation. And I remember typing these messages to friends, and these weird autocorrects would happen. And one of them that happened to show up was, "Your analogy is a sloppy menace." And I think about this a lot because I think analogies are sloppy menaces. We use them because that's sort of the structure that's available to us, but in a lot of ways they're sloppy and they're menacing. And so I'm just sort of pre-warning you that there will be lots of sloppy and menacing analogies throughout this presentation as an attempt to approximate to a conversation that I'm sort of grappling towards. So, as was noted, I'm an artist. I make text-based work. I'm really interested in language, the materiality of language, making installations that allow for me to sort of play with the shape and location of language, things that are burrowed, things that are in holes, things that are organized in places that maybe they shouldn't be, and thinking about language that sort of escapes the frame or the parameters of a given substrate or a given sort of format or stage. Most of the work that I'm really interested in is sort of thinking about language as being quite mercurial and sort of a trickster in a lot of ways, and so working with different layers of language and thinking about misunderstanding or incomprehension as sort of a generative state just for humanity, but also as a way to differentiate sort of rote engagement in the world from sort of a deeper, and I would say, more spiritual engagement with the world. Most of my work, as I noted before, sort of plays with the relationship between signal and noise. I like to say that I'm really interested in noise and very disinterested in signal. And so a lot of my practice involves me sort of going through archives, looking at things, and looking for the noise. So markings and marginalia, pieces of things that may not be the center of an archive or the center of a text or the plot of a text, and sort of reconfiguring those into new relationships. So I'm going to start off a little bit autobiographically. I grew up in Northern California in a small town called East Palo Alto. It is what is now part of Silicon Valley. I noted to someone earlier, Facebook is literally behind my parents' house. And as a young person, I was exposed to lots of emerging technologies. I've been on computers. I'll be 40 in like a month and a half. I've been on computers since I was 5 or 6. And before I really understood computing or computers in general, I always associated it with magic and the occult. And I will blame popular television for kids. This is the show Ghostwriter, and it was a show where a team of kids were engaging with this sort of spirit ghost in the computer that would take words off of the computer screen and morph them into space and then put them back into computers. And I always thought that was just so deeply magical. There's also Buffy, for folks who are old enough to remember the show, or Ghostwriter, where in this case she is sort of communing or having this conversation with a spirit that's been released from a book once it's been scanned. So the book is scanned, the spirit is released into the computer, and she engages in this sort of chat with the spirit over time. It wasn't until sort of 1998 when I joined this program called Plugged In that I realized it wasn't magic. It was language and code. A lot of what I thought was happening in terms of magic or these sort of other extraordinary things was literally sort of a functioning of how people have organized systems to appear magical. Plugged In was a program that was for kids in my neighborhood who wanted to learn how to code. And so at 11 or 12, I went into this program and spent a ridiculous amount of time making websites and coding and being fascinated with the idea that I could type in a line of information and refresh, and that line of information would create an image or create a page of content. As I was sharing with folks before, I took a bit of a break from anything tech related just because I grew up in the Bay Area and I was sort of tired of the tech bro culture, and I said I would never do anything related to machine learning or tech, and now I'm here and I've lied to myself, and so I think there's something interesting here. I wouldn't say that I'm deeply interested in machine learning in an independent way. I'm deeply interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence as it relates to conversations about death and lifespans. I'm going to give a few stories just to sort of contextualize this. When I was maybe 8 or 9, I remember going to my dad and I was like, "Hey, Dad, last night I was trying to wake up and I couldn't wake up and it was sleep paralysis." And my dad looks at me and he says, "Oh, don't worry about that, Kameelah. That was just God deciding whether or not you were going to get another day. You die every time you go to sleep, and then he wakes you up." And this is sort of my first conversation around death. And I remember saying to myself, so every time I go to sleep, I die, and then something else decides that I don't die, and I get to wake up again. And so I've been really interested in these sort of states of almost death, death, not being death. And this is my family before we expanded. But I remember having a conversation with my mom several years later where I was thinking about why people would pass in our family. I remember saying to my mom, "Hey, wouldn't it be so nice if we all just died at the same time? Then no one would miss each other." And my mother quickly reminded me that that was just a mass cold killing, and that's not something we're going to do. But it was this interesting moment where I was like, oh, I'm interested in death, but I'm also interested in like what happens when people are not here. What happens to the people who are still here? And as I got older, my mom started sharing a bit more with me. And for folks who may not know this reference, this is Christine Miller. She was a member of Jim Jones's People's Temple. It was a community that went down to Guyana in the 70s with Jim Jones, and unfortunately literally drank the Kool-Aid and died. And so this is a transcript of a conversation where Christine Miller is sort of rationalizing with Jim Jones about why or whether or not they had to die. And my mother recounts a story to me of a family friend being one of the people who went down to Jonestown and died. And so I think that there's, for me, this sort of interesting sort of relationship to necropolitics and thinking sort of through who gets to die, when they get to die, and what are sort of the constraints in the politics and poetics around that death. In this case, she's making the argument that she should get to control when she dies, and he's making the argument that she should not. We know how the story ends, but there's something interesting to me about the power of death and what it means to actually rest in peace. And then finally, before I get into some stuff, I've been doing a lot of genealogical research, and part of that has been trying to get back to figuring out who's who in my family. And so I've been spending a lot of time on Ancestry.com to sort of look for this very particular woman, this fourth great grandmother, unknown free black woman, unproven by record. And I bring this here because there's something very interesting to me around the conversation of LLMs and sort of the prioritization of written speech, written language that can be parsable, that can be processed, and what happens when there are holes in the archive, what happens when there are holes in written language, what happens when written language isn't a priority. And so part of this genealogical research has made me think a lot about death and what it means to reanimate when the sort of tools or the corpus for reanimation is not available. Some obituaries, and I'm mentioning them here mostly because I've been cleaning up my late grandmother's home and looking at the obituaries, and part of the sort of process of engaging with her, with my family's death, is sort of thinking about these larger geopolitical contexts of death and sort of the witnessing of death, the portrayal of death, the timing of death, and the sort of the necropolitics around when and who and how you die. This is an image from the current genocide in Gaza when bodies were returned, and I've been looking at a lot of these images of bodies sort of wrapped in these tarps, sort of like unassigned, and thinking about the particularity of both Islamic and Christian burial ceremonies, which require sort of a deep engagement with the body and personhood and what it means to not be able to have that right. Also just thinking about Hurricane Katrina as well within this context, thinking about the images that were sort of populated and created of the bodies that lay dead during that hurricane, and thinking again about body in this context and what it means for the image, for the narrative of this to persist longer than the person themselves. And finally, as I noted, or maybe I did note this, I'm in the process of training as a deaf doula. I think that when I develop an interest in something, it's important for me to learn the technical part of it, but I think there's a social, emotional, and sort of spiritual part that's important too. So I didn't want to think about machine learning and my interest in this without sort of the aligned practice and actually talking to people and being with people at stages of death. And I also did not want to do that without actually studying what death is in a biological context. So I'm in the process of deaf doula training, and then starting a program in a couple of months, studying death and as an advanced certificate. So before we get into that, I'll just add a note here. I have many curiosities, but as I noted before, they're oriented around lifespans. I'm really curious about what marks death of people, places, and things and ideas. And I'm thinking about how digital technologies impact the strategies that we employ to defend ourselves against inevitable death, and then also how digital technologies influence or possibly supplant embodied and generational death rituals. So I'm going to do a short and very incomplete and improper history of communicating with the dead. And I'm going to start with this image of my grandmother who passed away in 2023. And several nights after she had passed, I had a dream, and she was in the dream, and she was like, I'm good, I'm okay, I'm resting, I'm fine. And this was really important to me because I kept thinking about how was I going to speak to her again. And I said, I didn't have a pathway. She just sort of came and gave me a message, and I haven't seen her since then. And so that got me really interested in some previous research I've been doing around communicating with the dead. Starting in 1840s with spiritualism, and I'll note here this is very Western focused. Many of the other examples of ancestor communication and veneration I'll talk about at the end of the presentation, but for the purposes of speed, I'm going to talk about these examples. So you'll see this image of spiritualists sitting at a table, waiting for knocks, waiting for some sort of sign that someone who has departed is communicating with them. And I'm really interested in spiritualism as a practice, a technology of speaking with the dead that sort of predates a lot of what we see now in terms of chatbots or deathbots that are sort of programmed with language that can speak back to us when we call on it. Spiritualism is organized around a call for someone to come to the context for speaking and for them to speak through sort of this sort of pulling out and channeling. We probably are also very familiar with the planchette and the Ouija boards, another sort of technology that was organized around asking a question and using your hand to sort of guide you to an answer as a way to speak with someone who is, again, not here. Thomas Edison also was trying to create something called the spirit phone in 1920. He was very much not in favor of the weird and mystifying and occult approaches to this, and wrote that if this is ever accomplished, it will be accomplished not by any occult, mystifying, mysterious, or weird means, such as are employed by so-called mediums, but by scientific methods. And I think about this often because I think that in a lot of ways, I'm curious about what he would have thought about the deathbots, which we'll talk about shortly. There's also EVP, which is you take a device into a space, you record, you listen for something, and these are then interpreted as spirit voices. There are many different processes and methods for that we won't get into, but just wanted to include this in the genealogy. Another practice called psychomantum, which is basically setting up a chair and a mirror and then using that as sort of a tool for communication. And so in thinking about all these examples, there's a very rough sort of system that I'm creating in my brain around how I'm thinking about these systems for talking to the dead. Designing some sort of system to capture the signals, capturing some of the signals, then deploying some interpretive system to organize and digest the captured signals. And I actually hope that someone asks me about digestion and ingestion, because when Pierre mentioned it before, at a very there's something tickling me about the language of ingestion and digestion. And then finally, outputting the language as a message from the dead. This is very crude sort of crystallization of it, but for the purpose of our time, we're going to work with this. Many people, does anyone know this episode? This is from Black Mirror. Be Right Back, 2013, and it was the episode in which this woman loses her partner. She uploads her partner through this company, and he just lives with her as this sort of like figure in her home that is programmed with his likeness. Eventually, she gets very tired of him and puts him literally in the basement and takes him out of the basement when it is convenient for her. And this was 2013 when it felt very science fiction oriented, and now in 2025, many of the things that were sort of mentioned or sort of suggested in this episode feel a lot more possible. A lot of what I want to talk about today is sort of within the context of what many folks are calling digital necromancy, which is the practice of using any advanced technologies, particularly for me in this case, I'm thinking about LLMs through machine learning, to basically recreate or simulate the presence of a deceased person. I think it's really important to sort of think about this in the context of representation versus replacement versus any other sort of way that we can frame this. But the idea is that someone has passed, I have data from this person who has passed, there's a company that I can give said data to, and they can make my father again. They can make my mother again. I can converse with this new, different version from this data that I've been able to pull together. And this is from a project called Augmented Eternity and Swappable Identities up at MIT right now. And I'm just going to read the description because I thought I was misreading it, so I kept reading it over and over because I wanted to have misread it, but I didn't misread it. The description actually is, this project uses a distributed machine intelligence network to enable its users to control their growing digital footprint, turn it into digital representation, and share it as part of a social network. So essentially, I, pre-mortem, can sort of curate my data, upload it to an avatar. That avatar can be leased or rented or swapped with someone else who may want to engage with a version of me while I'm alive or even when I'm not here. The authors of the study go on, or this project go on to say, the project creates an evolving ontological mapping of an individual based on her digital interactions and allows the person to represent her aggregated knowledge base in a form of a software agent. This agent can then be rendered as a chatbot or a voice-based assistant. The project is aiming to open source a number of identity render kits to enable users to quickly share their knowledge base with a trust network. I don't think I have to say much about how bizarre this is, so I won't do that, but I think one of the things that I want to keep emphasizing about digital necromancy is that it relies on data harvesting. It relies on us giving data, it relies on someone harvesting it, and it's happening both in death and before death. This is the show Devs, which came out in 2020. It was a limited series and included sort of this conspiracy in the Silicon Valley-like context of people trying to create these different timelines because in this case, he really misses his now deceased daughter. Altered Carbon has sort of a similar timeline of these people who don't actually die but can be consistently reanimated to continue to work on behalf of a company, on behalf of someone. But there's this sort of chance of continual reanimation. Upload is another like Amazon series, which is sort of the same sort of framework of someone has passed, I upload their life, I get to engage with them, and they get to live in this other parallel universe at the same time. And I mention all of these sort of examples from popular culture because I think that as much as the academic sphere is important in thinking about these, I think it is important to think about some of the things folks were saying before around the normalization of a lot of these structures. That because we keep seeing it on TV, because we keep having episodes about it, because these things are seen as fictional and become somewhat normalized, I think sort of the pressure, resistance, or the friction that could be in relation to this is lessened because it feels more familiar. There's no sense here, but I think what I wanted to mention with this slide is that I was looking at a lot of sort of the hand configurations of spiritualism and these other attempts to sort of communicate with the dead, and then I started looking at these images of overhead shots of people typing, using a mouse, or even just the functions we use to swipe on a phone. And I kept thinking about this sort of gesture of the hand and its relationship to communicating with the dead. There's no conclusion, there's no thesis, but it's just something that kept popping up and looking at it that I want to return to in some capacity. But for here, it's just sort of like a little tangent thought that I wanted to include. So I'm going to get into one of the first known examples, and I like to say the first known example because we understand with technology first and last, and who did it first is controversial in terms of of notoriety, but also because timelines are different in notoriety and sort of the ability to advertise that something has been done is different. But the first sort of acknowledged bot was the Roman bot, and the Roman bot was created by a friend who lost their friend, and they kept reading old text messages from their friend, and they said it would be really, really great if I were able to talk to him more frequently. So they basically programmed an app called Luca, which sort of functions in sort of the more rudimentary uses of an LLM, to basically take all those text messages in English and in Russian and then to use them. What is interesting about this example is that instead of this only being used by his family or by his friends, this was released on the App Store for anyone to use to sort of converse with. This is very interesting to me because I think on one hand, when I think about Deathbots and their engagement, I think about them in terms of being this sort of this private occasion for a select group of people, but this idea that someone's private text messages, then programmed and fed into an LLM and trained, are then made available in the App Store becomes interesting. And I'm not going to get into all the ethical issues of Deathbots. I'm going to assume that those are evident, but I do want to just sort of mention the difference with this particular bot in that it was a public tool versus a private tool that someone had to request access to. So like I said, Deathbots, AR-powered chatbots, they are designed to mimic, and I think the language of mimicry is important here. They have, unfortunately, because of marketing, have been sort of thought about as something that literally is a replacement. And this is a very, very quick and rough sort of summarization of the process. I'm most interested in the data collection and data processing part of this, which is basically any available and processable written material that's authored by the deceased is collected and given to a company. And I want to pause here really quickly because there are a couple of things that feel important here. There are companies that allow for you to do this pre-mortem, which means I, as the data donor, can decide to sort of create this sort of corpus of information that I then save and say, when I'm dead, make a bot for me. Other cases are people have passed, they have left nothing behind in terms of their intentions, and someone else, a third party, sort of submits this. There's a recent paper by Morris and Brubaker from 2024 talking about generative ghosts, which I'll talk about shortly, where they talk about sort of the question of provenance. And I think this is sort of interesting language to use, particularly because provenance within sort of art world, archival communities is used to talk about the history of ownership, the provenance of a painting, the provenance of a collection. And so I do think it's interesting that in this particular paper, they're using the language of provenance as a way to talk about who initiates or creates the bot. This language around ownership feels important to me as we sort of get into some language around zombies. Also, when thinking about data collection and data processing, I think it's important to note that we're talking about processable written material. So things that are written are in a format that can be easily given to a commercial company, things that are easily decoded, right? So a text message that may be in a vernacular that is not processable, may be sort of mixing or pulling between different languages, or in some way is not transparent, there is some opacity, cannot be included in something like this because the goal is for it to be processable and transparent enough to be predictable enough to be repeated. And so part of this data cleaning and curation is interesting and important to me because I think it says a lot about prioritizing written language over orality. So I think about like if someone were to scrape my emails and text messages, would that be an efficient or accurate representation of me? Absolutely not. I'm a very different person on text message than I am in person, live, speaking. And so I'm also really interested in sort of the narrowing of personhood through this process, that a person is just simply a collection of the things that they have written and the things that they have written that can be processed and the things that they have written that can be processed and then tokenized in a way that can then be trained in this particular manner. It goes through this process, it's deployed. These processes have been called reanimation, rebirth, resurrection. These are all fun words for me as a former Catholic school student. I'm really excited about the language of resurrection and rebirth being used here. And then we get to this other part of the user prompting it. This use and interaction becomes this sort of feedback loop. And I want to keep noting again, this can be before or after death, and that sort of moment of before or after death, I think is important to sort of think about the politics of what it means to exceed your biological lifespan. Here are some examples of companies. They, I will say, are all severely creepy companies. And I said to myself, Kameelah, for you to really do research on this, you need to make something. You need to do this. And I said, I'm going to do it for the research. And then I said, I absolutely will not do it for the research. These things are very, very bizarre to me because in some ways there's sort of this preemptive familiarity, right? This idea that, yeah, just get on this app and record an interview, and then we'll take your interview and we'll turn it into this. And I'm like, I don't know you, and I don't know what you're going to do with this information. And so there is a bit of a gap in my research in terms of me having to understand this through other people's accounts of it or through a company's description of their service. And so I just want to note that as a limitation. One of the companies that I found most interesting was StoryFile, which basically takes corpuses of information. Museums have used this. Other people have used this to sort of recreate historical interviews. But basically, they take the corpus of written language, they train it, and they produce a video avatar that can speak with that. And so I can't remember this guy's name here. Who's this man in StoryFile? That guy? Does anyone remember his name? William Shatner? Yeah. There you go, okay. So they let you test it out. So I basically asked William Shatner some questions. It was absolutely horrible. He does not know what he's talking about. The responses were so bizarre, but just this idea that this is a service being offered was really fascinating. Hereafter.ai is an app that allows for you in your living time to basically go in and it prompts you with a series of interview questions, allows for you to upload images, video, a range of things, and then you can like share this with a family or friend and they can talk to you without talking to you before you die. Versonas is another company that sort of tagline is legacy through technology. Project December was one of the earlier ones, and they had sort of like a beta stage, and they're now in this other place. And I think it's sort of fascinating. It says get started now for $10, and I kept saying to myself, for $10, you're going to create a version of my grandmother. And I said, you're charging me so little, so you must be getting a lot out of this. And so I think there's also this question for me around sort of articulation of privacy for your data and the impossibility of that. Seance AI is another version. You can create a digital seance using AI. Eternals Replica is an AI companion, so it technically could be a girlfriend, it could be a boyfriend, it could be anyone, but is now also being used for the deceased. And there are a range of Chinese companies as well that are also engaged in this. And someone who is doing much deeper deeper research than I am and have capacity for is looking at why some of these companies are more prevalent in certain parts of the world. I want to get into zombies because part of what I am trying to articulate about my interest, understanding, and relationship to Deathbots, Griefbots is sort of this question around reanimation without consent and reanimation for labor. And so I use this language of like zombified language or zombie language, and I don't think that's still the precise language, but what's important for me to emphasize here is that the idea of dying and then having peace is interrupted by these technologies, which for all of us means that at any point, if we die tomorrow, someone could just take our text messages and create something else of us. And so I'm really interested in zombies as this sort of like archetype, but also part of this historical grounding in Haitian folklore, in colonialism, in slavery. And so this is from the Zombie Reader by Sarah Juliet Lauro, and she wrote a book that I had read before, and I saw that she had this reader where she's sort of summarizing her articulation of what a zombie is. And she writes, some may think of this monster as American, but is deeply global. While I trace the zombie's history in detail in my book, The Transatlantic Zombie, I'll keep to a thumbnail sketch here, one that is specific to my own assessment of the myth's transmission. I argue in my book that the zombie is an American monster only in the sense that it comes directly out of our history of colonialism, enslavement, exploitation, and appropriation. The zombie's lineage can be traced to African soul capture myths that were carried to the New World aboard slave ships bound for the colonial Caribbean. The zombie, as we know it today, comes from the Haitian zombie, a product of sorcery in which a witch doctor enslaves a victim whom he has raised from the dead to do his bidding or work for him for free. I'm going to pause here because I want to keep emphasizing that for all the television shows and movies that we've seen about zombies, Walking Dead, all this stuff, what's important for me is the historical context of this, which is a zombie is someone who is reanimated without consent to do free labor. That is its purpose. And so when I think about zombified language or zombies in relation to deathbots, I'm thinking about what does it mean for labor to happen after death, but what does it mean for language to labor or for someone to make your language labor on their behalf? Because as I'll get to in a moment, you can shape these bots as you want. She goes on to write, keeping the zombie perpetually in a semi-conscious state in between living and dead, the zombie master maintains control, it is said, by means of a powerful narcotic or poison concoction. In its earliest iterations, the zombie was read as symbolic of the Caribbean country's past as a plantation economy built on slave labor, drained of its own resources and existing only for the benefit of others. Importantly, the zombie was first brought to Hollywood's attention as a direct result of the neo-colonial occupation of Haiti, where after the figure was reshaped and rebranded with the mark of a new society's concerns. I want to also pause here because there's a book and the author's name has escaped me. It's called Resurrecting the Black Body, Digital Afterlives. And I think I want to say Tonya Sutherland. But one of the things that she mentions is the sort of early reanimation of Black celebrities, from the example of Tupac being reanimated at Coachella through a hologram and sort of using his voice, and then these other examples of Michael Jackson being reanimated for him to perform Slave to a Rhythm. And she makes a note in that text that he is slave to a rhythm, but also slave to this sort of perpetual reanimation. And so I want to couch all of this as I wrap up in something I learned recently, which was called terror management theory. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, my sort of field of research is a wild mixture of like random poetics and just random stuff. And so this never sort of really crossed my horizon in terms of something to make a connection to. But I was speaking on Instagram with a scholar named Dr. Zoe Samudizi, and she was, I had written something about this conference, and I said, oh, I'm going to be talking about zombies and deathbots, and I was explaining things to her, and she said, oh, do you know what terror management theory is? And I was like, no, but I really want to know what it is. And so I just want to give a thanks to her for bringing this sort of to the surface for me. But terror management theory originates with Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, where he sort of postulates this idea that most of the things that we do as living people is trying to avoid or distract ourselves from the inevitability of death. Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom, whose name I'm going to mispronounce, in their book, The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life, went on to sort of elaborate to suggest that the terror of this unavoidable death is managed through life extension efforts, things that we do to literally extend our lives and to figuratively extend our lives to sort of circumvent this biological inevitability. And this comes from a recent paper by Raquel Ferrandez called Strategies for Colonizing Death, the Online Dead, Griefbots, and Transhumanist Dragons. I wanted to talk a lot about transhumanism today, but we only have 30 minutes, so we're not going to get to that, but I do want to emphasize this sort of language around being deprived of death in relation to this conversation regarding zombies, in relation to this attempt to sort of resist the terror of death. And in this text that I just mentioned, there is this very sort of very clear point, which is to manage this terror of death, we must defend ourselves. And I'm really struck by this language of defending ourselves against a biological inevitability. But when it comes to sort of questions around machine learning and LLMs, what becomes really interesting to me is that one of our defense mechanisms, our attempts to sort of extend our life, is to harvest our own data, to collect so much data about ourselves that either we make the proposal to extend our life while we're alive, or we give it to someone else as a third party to keep us going, even when we're not physically here. And I like analogies, so I sort of thought about this relationship to natural death, and natural death is a problematic term just in terms of so much death being unnatural, but this idea of like, my body starts biologically functioning, I die. And then this other sort of like a comma, which is sort of a slow down, reroute, pivot. These are these proposals to defeat death or extend life. And I sort of took this image of myself and I said, oh, I die, period. I'm gone. And then I started thinking about like what it would mean to sort of stretch myself across this sort of time period in perpetuity with these commas, this idea that I just keep going and going and going and going. And I said, oh, I feel so tired. Like the idea that I would have to keep going feels exhausting. But I wanted to think about this in terms of grammar because I think there's something particularly interesting about constructions of language, rules of language, and this notion of bad grammar. And sort of the bad grammar that is sort of how these Griefbots function, and sort of the expectation that we want to engage in this bad grammar. I'm going to share some examples of attempts to defeat death or to avoid death that are outside of the death or Griefbot as a way to sort of shape what I guess I'm proposing, which is that the Griefbots are not new. They are a current iteration of what we've always been trying to do. So I'll first start with some examples of attempts to defend or to extend life or to just be able to predict when you're going to die and thinking about the spiritual and religious context. When I moved to New York in 2010, someone kept sliding these pamphlets under my door. It was the reminder that the rapture was happening on May 21st, 2011. I waited on May 21st, 2011. Nothing happened. Very disappointing, very frustrating. And I mention this because part of this sort of attempt to defend against death is to sort of predict, make dates, make appointments to ascertain what exactly is going to be the death so I can understand how my afterlife is going to go. I also like to look at examples of esoteric Islamic diagrams. This is from Ibn Arabi. He was a Sufi scholar from the Andalusian region, and he created these two images. He created these two images here. Actually, this is not from Ibn Arabi. This is from another person whose name is escaping right now. The point is that these are called planes of assembly. This is basically on the day of judgment, what it will look like, what will happen. It is a diagram of certainty about all the things that will happen. And I think about this in terms of a sort of relationship to wanting to defeat death, or at least to be able to get ahead of death so that you can make your sort of plans and predictions. So the sort of specificity of this is quite interesting to me for the reason, it actually is Ibn Arabi, my bad, it is him. This specificity is important to me for the reason of sort of thinking about these attempts to avoid, predict, get ahead of death, or to extend life. I'm also thinking architecturally. Many folks may have remembered this big craze in 2017, 2016 of these luxury survival bunkers where real estate companies were literally selling underground bunkers. And I was fascinated by this because I was like, wow, rich people just don't want to die. Like they're going to build something underground and burrow themselves underground to avoid the apocalypse while everyone else is dead. Like, I don't get it. But the articles were really fascinating to me because it made me keep thinking again about this attempt to avoid, to defeat, to defend oneself against death. These life extension organizations, People Unlimited, Coalition for Radical Life Extension, Sierra Sciences, Defy Time, these are all organizations, again, sort of organized around being able to decide when they're going to die and to be able to, again, extend your life. These are different than the examples of digital necromancy, but again, sort of function in the same context of attempts to sort of fight against the terror of death. There's a new job that has emerged called digital embalmers. They are literally people who are assigned to anyone who is interested in sort of curating their digital afterlife, supporting people in identifying what sort of data to make available, where to store it, what their sort of will should look like, but digital embalming as a sort of practice. This is a bizarre example, but this is from Milan in 2015. A Dutch designer created a memory box, and it's literally, sorry there are kids in here, there's a dildo that has the ashes of a deceased partner. When I presented this before, people were like, why are you presenting this? This is bizarre. And I said, yes, it is bizarre, but I think this is important for me to emphasize, again, of these attempts to keep people with us. Someone has passed, and we can't deal with that, right? So we create all these sort of technologies, tools, systems, to keep them here. And part of these systems also are included in things like Arch Mission Foundation. This is a self-deputized group of folks who have decided that if this Earth situation goes to shit, quite honestly, that there's a backup disk. So they've created something called a lunar library that they've sent to the moon. So if the Earth falls apart, someone who discovers these disks on the moon can reboot Earth. I kind of think about this as an LLM in its own way, in that they have selected which data is part of this reboot. As I get towards the end, I'll show a couple other examples. This is a new service that exists called Living Headstones QR codes. You can have a QR code on your cemetery headstone that someone can scan, and they can figure out how many papers you've written and how amazing you are. These are real services that exist, and I'm really fascinated, again, about these sort of life extension efforts that sort of cross the boundary between digital and not digital technology, but sort of exist in the same framework. And so I'll end here on some more notes around Deathbots. We know what Deathbots are. We didn't talk about generative ghosts, but what I'll mention here from this recent paper with Morris and Brubaker, basically generative ghosts being, again, these doppelgängers, these twins, but the difference in this case meaning that they can actually enter society. They can enter economic activity. They can be in a meeting for you when you can't be in a meeting. There's something about the pre-mortem context of this, and so this is the current leap or the direction many folks think we are going, and I wanted to mention it here because I feel like we should get ahead of this just a little bit. We should probably think about this. So I'll end on this note from Alison Parrish. Alison Parrish is a poet and computational scholar who I learned about through my time teaching at the School for Poetic Computation, and she delivered a lecture on transcription. And she's basically talking about transcription, this process. You take something that someone's been said or written, and you try to put it into plain text, right? And so when she writes this, she says, when I say that nothing survives transcription, what I mean is that when transcription happens, the result is a crime scene, a murder, which leaves behind a body. The word we use for text data set is after our corpus, Latin for body, cognate with the English word corpse. But maybe that's too violent of a metaphor. Instead, we might think of transcription as a kind of hospice, an institution whose role is to guide a stretch of language from this life to the next. And I'm thinking about to what extent are Griefbots sort of becoming this sort of hospice, and what does it mean to sort of engage with these limbos or states of suspension, whether it's purgatory, spiritual worlds, these sort of in-between states. There are other slides, but I feel like Mateo, my time is over. Is my time over? Yeah, you're saying yes. Okay, I'm gonna stop here and yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kameelah.
Thank you.
You know, you could have taken a few minutes more. It's extremely interesting. I think also structuralists, when they were talking about the death of the subject, they could not foresee these becomings. I think it's great to end the conversation of these 3-day symposium with your thoughts. I think you have been like, wrapping and warping our perception of the abstraction of AI models. I open to questions, and I see Mika, and I see Johnny, and more. I think I start from Mika and Johnny, and then we move this way. We need a microphone for Mika.
Hi, thanks for a really captivating talk. I was thinking about, especially throughout the kind of earlier part of your talk, you were consequently using the word communication, but what came to my mind was more communion. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you have thought about the relationships of those concepts, and if maybe what's going on here is like turning communion into communication, or like communication seems more banal to me and less, there's like an intensity lacking in it. So just...
Thank you so much for that question. That was actually the end of the presentation that I didn't get to. So when I first learned about Griefbots, my first response was, wow, this feels silly because there are traditions for ancestor communication and veneration. Indigenous code, many societies find ways to talk to the dead that do not require a chat client for that, right? And I was like, just do that. Like, what are we doing, right? And so I started interviewing friends of mine who engaged in ancestor veneration and communication. One friend who was Zulu, one friend who was Twi in West Africa. And part of what became really interesting is that there was like this very clear interest. First, they were very aggressively like, this is ridiculous and wrong. You do not talk to ancestors like this. A couple of things that came up were, first, the idea of ancestor communication, an ancestor veneration implies a relationship, right? And so my friend in South Africa was telling the story of like, if I need to speak to an ancestor, I light in pepo, which is like a sage herb. I ask a question or I say hello. I don't get a response until that ancestor is ready. It's not on my timeline. And so the difference between sort of this relationship between being able to talk to someone and having relationships with someone is very different, right? In the context of ancestor veneration and communication, in his practice, you ask for something, you say hello, then you have to wait. And they tell you, they get back to you when they're ready. Whereas with the chat client, it becomes a service versus a form of communication or a form of communion. I want to talk to you at 3 o'clock in the morning, so you must respond to me at 3 o'clock in the morning. However, we're sort of thinking about the sort of embodiedness or consciousness of the thing talking back to you. There is still this sense of like on demand grief engagement versus with ancestor veneration, there's a sense of waiting. And that waiting is also inflected by relationships between signal and noise. So when I'm talking to a chatbot, I'm just gonna get signal, right? You're gonna get back to me exactly what is programmed for you to give back to me. I may get some nonsense, but for the most part, I'm expected to get these very clear messages. When it comes to ancestor veneration and communication, there is this sense that I must be attuned to signal and noise, because I may have a dream, I may see something, I may hear something, and I need to be paying attention to all of that and parse it out. There's a space of interpretation, and there's a space of making sense and building relational context that doesn't happen with the chatbot, because the chatbot is just giving you what you want. Whereas with ancestor veneration, you'd be like, should I marry this person? 2 months later, no, you should not. Whereas your chatbot might be like, absolutely should marry this terrible man. You should absolutely marry him. And so I think that I really like this distinction you're making between communication and communion, because one feels very much service-oriented, feels very clinical, and the other is about having a generational relationship with someone where someone else, even if you don't believe in the spiritual context, has agency in responding. They cannot respond, they can respond how they wish, but there's a sense of agency that's not in the context of a Griefbot.
There's, I think, Johnny after, right? And then we go this way.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. It was a really nice way to end the day. I have many things. I was just going to share 3 findings in the spirit of what you brought to us. One is that I think what you're pointing us to has a kind of dynastic quality too. People say, you know, the conspiracy theories about whether Putin is dead. But we're definitely leading into a world in which, in the same way that land trusts, after wealthy people have died, have had long historical tales in terms of setting conditions for possibility for future generations. You know, whatever Trump's version of this will be, or any other kind of leader, I'm fascinated to see what I would love to hear your thoughts. I was also going to say on the zombie point, I studied the founders of AI, and they were all, I don't want to say often, but like Dexedrine or amphetamines were a part of the routine, right? That's how they did their work, and it just made me think about the connection between chemical states and imagination. And last thing I was going to say is, this is maybe a less bleak thing, but you mentioned digestion at the beginning, and I've been interested in work on kind of AI's environmental conditions and thinking about how it lacks metabolism for all that we assign to it about a life-like quality. It's oblivious to its own energetics, which means it's nothing like human life or any other type of life. And that seems like a significant vulnerability, but it's just bubbles that come to mind.
I love all of these thoughts, and I'm going to be very brief because brevity is not a strong suit, so I'm going to practice now. I really like the language of long historical tales, because I think in a lot of ways, when we think about systems and structures and continuity and discontinuity, there is the assumption that a person or a very particular structure is still visible, alive, functioning. But I think to your point, land trust, when we donate to endowments, all of these sort of ways are ways for us to exist in the world beyond our biological context, and for us to continue to impact and inflect systems even in our death. So I just wanted to note that. The note about amphetamines, what's interesting here is I just joined a working group at Harvard School of Divinity I'm sort of like lurking in the mailing list around psychedelics and spiritual practice. And part of the interest in that was sort of thinking about how altered states impact our relationship to death. And so there is a workshop that I need to go back and look at, which was around Islam and psychedelics and sort of relationships to death. But I bring all that back to the amphetamines because I do think that there is sort of a connective tissue here between substance-based attempts to commune with the dead that are very prevalent in many societies that I didn't get to that I want to spend a bit more time with. And then the note around metabolism is really fascinating to me, also because I spent a bit of time last year studying ingestion and digestion-based spiritual rituals. So the idea of, went to Catholic school as a Muslim kid, the idea of taking communion and ingesting, that being a practice or a ritual of full understanding. There's a practice in West Africa called Kombe where students at Islamic schools will write their Quranic studies, they wash it off and they drink it. This idea that for you to really learn to actually take in, to read, is actual literal ingestion, right? There's a German practice of eating the stamps with the faces of saints. There's a whole bunch of these. And so when you talked about metabolism, metabolism also is sort of like a chemical biological awareness of capacity too. And so the idea that an LLM or that a bot doesn't have a metabolism, I think comes back to this sort of notion of like how well marketing has done in terms of convincing us otherwise, that this thing is actually engaged in some sort of chemical, biological reality with me when it's just not. It has no awareness of its own capacity when it's full, when it's not full, what it can do with its energy. And so I thank you for this language of metabolism. Again, it's really helpful.
Yes, I think, I don't know, there is Johnny and then Matt and then Xenia.
Thank you very much. That was a beautiful, beautiful talk. And I knew some of the examples that you presented there on this afterlife services and feeling like this is bizarre. And then the more you show, the less bizarre they became. And something came to my mind that I haven't thought about that. And thank you for that, which is that in the end, people who write, right, are sort of doing the same thing. I mean, we read Marx and we make it work still even if he's dead, and we're reading the text and we reread it and we talk with them and we continue. So you can imagine that authors like Marx or Nietzsche, the ones, let's say the ones we love, themselves were through language, in particular through writing and text and publishing, doing that work. And probably everyone here who's writing things and wanting them to be published and in public and outlive us are kind of doing the same. And suddenly I realized that I haven't thought, but this could be put into the dimension of a democratization of authorship, right? I mean, why Marx and not everyone at that epoch? Maybe now what is happening is that it's not bizarre at all. And if someone gives you the service for that, why not? So I'm not sure how this is relevant or true, but came from your talk, and I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there are about 40 other slides that I had to remove because that was the proper thing to do. But I want to first think about the first thing you said around literature outliving. And I think that when I think about death in relation to literature, I think that I'm mostly interested in two sort of practices. One of this sort of community of writers, poets who engage in spirit communication. So folks like Lucio Clifton or Sylvia Plath, who have these practices of sitting down with the Ouija board or sitting down with some other divination tool, device, strategy to sort of talk to the dead, right? And that being their sort of writing practice was literally in conversation with the dead. So what they produced as writing was a conversation between them and the dead. And then some of the examples that I've shown before of these older attempts to talk to the dead, there are books, of course, that have been published of like this conversation I had with the spirit. And so I think that's just like one very direct example of why people saying writing is a form of talking to the dead. I'm transcribing this conversation, right? I think the other part where you mentioned, like, isn't writing just this attempt to sort of outlive? I think it is, but I think the other part of it that feels deeply interesting to me is sort of thinking about Umberto Eco when he talks about ghost chapters and inferential walks. That when I read a text, as I'm reading the text, someone is going on an inferential walk to fill in holes, and in the process of doing that, they're creating these sort of like ghost chapters, these things that haunt the thing that was written there. And so when I think about text outliving, I don't know that for me, and I'm not a literary theorist, I don't know if for me I think about the text wanting to outlive itself as much as the text existing in relation to many other things so that people can keep living and reanimating in relation to that. So I don't think about it as standing alone, like the book stands alone, it lives, but the book keeps being sort of recirculated in new contexts, and that its livingness is sort of contingent on our willingness to engage with it. If we don't engage with it, I would consider it sort of have died. It's sort of like a vestigial thing over here to the side, but I think it is the human interaction with these texts that no longer have living authors that is the reanimation, not just their existence independently. And then I think the last note about these companies, I think for me, and it's a note I didn't get to, I think that, again, the assumption that a person's essence is purely linguistic is deeply problematic. I think about the depths of oral culture and how there may be a person who, like, my grandmother doesn't have anything written. That lady was 90 years old, and we had to fight her to get a cell phone. And she wrote everything by hand in terrible handwriting. Like, there's no way that that would have been ever processable. And so I think there is an element for me of, like, what does it mean to over-prioritize written language in the Latin alphabet and familiar vernaculars that are parsable versus recognizing the extra-linguistic realities of someone's existence.
I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for that. So your last comment and the questions of oral cultures brings up, this wasn't what I was going to mention, but I think of Gilgamesh and the first written piece of literature that we have, right? And one of the themes of Gilgamesh is the desire to inscribe his stories so that he can live he can live through his writing, right? So I think even with the very first piece of literature that we have, there's a connection between writing and death, right? This brings up randomly also what Nancy said about the paintings in the grotto. I'm not sure exactly where to go with this, but your hands and the suggestion of hands make me think of the hand paintings. Right?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it, but
so the origin of the human is not in what is seen, but in the gesture, right?
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask, or what I wanted to say is, what's interesting to me is that you talked about the preppers, right? These billionaire preppers. I just watched Mountainhead the other day. I don't know if you know.
I'm going to write it down, though.
Yeah. But it's a satire of billionaires, right? Clearly, it's Musk and Bezos go away to this secluded, mountain home. They're all accelerationists, and the character, Steve Carell's character, it is diagnosed with terminal illness, and he wants to push the tech in order to be the first person once AGI hits. Yeah. To upload himself, right, digitally so that he can live forever. You're talking about Deathbots, which is a desire, just real quick. You're talking about Deathbots as a desire of those who have lost someone. I'm curious about the desire of those, who want to preserve themselves in death, right?
Yeah.
This like transhumanist desire to live forever. Black Mirror, San Junipero, right? You live in the computer. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
I'll make it very quick. Sorry, I'm like laughing. I think my immediate response is that maybe this is not the right thing to say. The people who are most invested in preserving and uploading themselves are probably the people that should not exist into perpetuity. I'm just going to say that there's a certain amount of arrogance there, and I think that part of the reason that's part of the reason why I didn't sort of present on that element of it, but it's definitely there, right? I think the other part, when I mentioned the Arch Mission Foundation and their like lunar library, I think there's an extreme amount of arrogance in all of these attempts in terms of assuming that any of us want a rerun of whatever this Earth timeline is, right? But this idea that if the Earth were to fall apart, that we would want to reboot the Earth as it is. We would want to reboot civilization as it is. And so I think that in a lot of ways, Griefbots, all this technology reveal who has power in society because they would like to reboot society as it is because they are benefiting from the organization of society. And so I think there is something there in terms of like paying attention to who wants to be rebooted and who wants to be uploaded and who wants to be here forever, and then paying attention to what impact they've already had in their living life and whether we would want that to keep going. I'm going to say no because I'm thinking about the people who want to do this, and no, we don't want you here now, so we don't want you. Anyway, please.
Ksenia, please.
Yes, thank you so much. Maybe I can try to transform it into a comment of sorts. It's been fascinating and beautiful, and I was thinking about how your idea of reanimation matches on kind of the embodied and disembodied dynamic enabled by the new technology of AI, and your historical perspective, right, matches kind of nicely, but also problematizes this, right? Think about spiritualism as telegraph. Think about photography as dead children. This has been like all over medium, right? Russian cosmisms. This is space travel, right? And finally we get AI. And so I think like this tension between embodiment and myth is like very thought-provoking, and I loved your slides with your picture and dot and comma.
Amira, please.
Yeah, okay, also for me, thank you so much. I also love the term severely creepy company. I think it should be a technical term in many ways. But what I find so striking about your work is that it makes so evident to what degree many of us have come to accept that the world just consists of data and can be kind of like completely captured and, you know, exist in perpetuity, as you say, as a simulation. And I'm kind of wondering what that says about our political moment, if we have that desire. And I think also maybe that leads into the closing discussion in a good way. But
should I respond or no?
Yes, please.
Okay.
We have another question by
So how about we hear that one and then I just do it together?
Okay.
Just for
yeah,
ease?
I think we are having a great. I think Anne first because I'm the chair and the moderator, and then Mika that had already the opportunity to make a question.
It's more of a comment than a question, really. But since we started talking about uploading. There's a story, I think, it actually also relates to Gilgamesh, I guess, that Christopher Morcom, who was Turing's very close friend, who died when he was 18 or very young anyway, that Turing was interested in the idea of artificial intelligence in some sense because of uploading humans and because of Christopher specifically. And the other thing that I wanted to just mention to tie things up is the Philip K. Dick bot, which was quite early. That was using LSA, which is sort of like the second or third reinvention of distributional semantics.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask one more question. Yeah, so I can't resist making this short anecdote. So in 2016, a close friend of me and a lot of comrades in New York died in a car crash delivering supplies to Standing Rock. And there was a long process after his death where people were trying to figure out a way of collective grief. And after that, I wrote an anonymous text for this platform called Ill Will about those efforts, and there I ended up thinking about this event through Nietzsche's dice throw, and using the dice throw to try to understand transhumanist, fascist, and communist relationships to death. And I feel like the transhumanist, that's like using the law of great numbers to figure out the means and have sort of predictive relationship to death. And then the fascist is like kind of conquering the dice throw, going for the victorious dice throw, the kind of neme frego of the Italian fascist fighter pilot flying into his death. And then the communist being the kind of amor fati of just accepting the dice throw. So I was thinking about, do you think there's like a fascist tendency also that emerges from these versus the transhumanist? And do you see any sort of, is there like a boundary there? Because I feel like we shouldn't conflate all these modes of approaching death. I think there are many many enemies or epistemological enemies in the among the companies, et cetera, that you are looking at?
So first thing, I wasn't laughing at you. I was laughing because, yeah, fascism. That's what I was laughing at, because I don't know what else to do but laugh about fascism now. So there are a bunch of things that I want to say, and I want to connect these two things, because I think your question around how much data we produce day to day, right? And what that means, that we're constantly producing data, and this question around the specificity of our epistemological enemies is really important, because I think part of when I came into sort of this community of machine learning, AI, I think that there was this sort of like, AI is terrible for this reason. And then as you get a little bit deeper, it's like, yeah, it's still kind of terrible, but like for all these nuanced reasons. And I think that being able to sort of pick at these nuanced reasons did two things for me. The first, it allowed for me to make arguments about things in a more targeted way. And being able to make those arguments in a more targeted way helped me actually parse out not so much solutions, but sort of strategies, right? And so to your point of like clumping everything together, what that does is it makes it difficult for us to have a targeted critique and a targeted approach, right? So when I think about something like a Deathbot and its collection, and like I have so much data on the internet, like there's nothing I can do about it at this point, right? But I think about Zora Neale Hurston, and she, when she was collecting folklore in the 30s from Black folks, she has this excerpt in Mules and Men where she says, you know, like Black folks, like we, you know, will smile, but we're like particularly evasive. We'll laugh in your face. We'll like tell you what you want. We'll put something outside the door for you. She says, we'll put something outside the door for you to play with, because knowing so little about us, you don't know that you don't have anything. And then she says, you can read my writing, but you sure can't read my mind. And so I think that in being able to sort of parse out what exactly we're trying to address, it allows for us to think about strategies of like data subterfuge, data withholding, data, like I think there's a particular approach for all of these things. And I think for me, when it comes to Griefbots, part of the reason why I wanted to go into depth with work was to find a point of intervention that wasn't so much about trying to get companies to do something different as much as it is about supporting and empowering people to create wills and post-death plans that actually empower themselves beyond that, right? Because I don't think that any of these companies are going to listen to me, but I can, through my own practice as a deaf doula, actually get people to start thinking about this now versus later. And I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm going to stop talking. Yeah. Thank you.
No, thanks, Kameelah. I mean, we can maybe, yeah. Thanks, Kameelah. That was great. I hope you can use the meiotic power of your presentation to what happens, what comes after death. Final discussion. Yeah, this is like. No, Amira, I would like to invite Amira, and you can also.
I stay.
You can stay here. I mean, I think the final discussion is a collective discussion, and we are here, I mean, to celebrate the final hours, hopefully, of this intense symposium. I think I will rely maybe on some help from Tommaso and all the other members of the group that want to join. I don't know how to structure the final discussion, but I think Amira has some prospects about the future. What comes after death is also maybe a collective publication. Maybe, Amira, you want to say something about this?
Sure. I mean, the idea is to make this somewhat durable, although hopefully not undead. And kind of, yeah, I mean, we have this idea of having a special issue with the Cambridge Forum of AI. So if you're interested in that, please reach out, and we'll have a call ready, hopefully, well, within the next 2 weeks, more or less. Yeah. So yeah, think about it. We would love to have you, all of you, actually. And yeah, I mean, with that, I don't know, how do we want to do this in terms of final discussion?
I think we had many questions coming from all of us, so I think we can use this moment to frame some final comments and notes. I have some notes written in my laptop.
But yeah, I would also really like to hear what people thought were common themes, possibly. I mean, I have my own notes here and like a bunch of open questions, but I know those. I would be more interested in hearing from you.
Yeah, I think also, after Kameelah, it's a bit intimidating to try a synthesis. No.
No, but over there was a hand. So Xenia, start us off, please.
I was really curious
Please,
I was
the microphone.
like fascinated by the discussions. Like from day one, I was like pestering my team. I was like, why do you ask about isomorphism? But then, like, you know, everyone was talking about analogies and metaphors, and it's interesting how like people coming from different disciplinary perspectives, we are still kind of, this is our common ground in a sense, because we all use this analytically or within like our materials. And I would love to think more through this, especially with philosophers, because you are present here and it looks like you have more tools to deal with this distinction, especially with literature scholars, right, who are so professional in thinking through metaphors. So that's kind of what I hope to learn from you is probably like, yeah, how to work with these three categories and how helpful they are to think about, right, this relationship between LLMs and their relationship to the world and to people. Yeah, so that's where I stop.
Tommaso, please, if Tommaso wants to.
I don't know if it works. No?
It's the wrong button.
Okay, it's this. Thanks. But one thing interesting is that the idea that also the basic vectorial model, the famous addition with vectors, is not a real analogy. It's a simulation of an analogy. And this is one thing that I think that, I don't know, we discussed with Baratto the idea that maybe those models aren't capable of analogies in the sense that human beings or living beings are capable of using analogies. So this is, for me, it's one topic. So that analogy is some kind of related to thinking. And given that we are saying that this is a sort of simulation of thinking is not capable of analogy. Mathematical.
Okay. I mean, I think to me this brings up one of the challenges I see, like when you do these, like one of these symposiums, and it goes also to the center of all the questions we kind of discussed, right? But I think what you bring up, for me at least, is a question of translation, and the question of translation between different disciplines, and the question of how we reason within different disciplines, right? And I mean, I don't think I have a solution there or a clear explanation of how we do it, but I think this goes back to what was said also at the last panel, actually by Pierre, I think, about the, we have to depurify maybe our ways of thinking while also not falling into the trap of completely accepting a different type of reasoning. And I'm not sure if we, what we should do, but I think, and that is also something that at least repeatedly came up in coffee conversations with me, but that might also be my problem, right? Is the question of, seriously, what do humanities do in this moment, right? And to what degree, there are attempts in the humanities where I feel like, okay, they are pretty quick in kind of just, making themselves superfluous in response. And I find that a challenging, tricky, horrible response to what's going on. But I am wondering, what do we do and how do we kind of develop further, which is also, I would be excited for this special issue partially for that reason, to kind of think through what we can do together in theorizing, countering, developing a better understanding that, comes from embodied thinking and not from somewhere else.
Just one note, I think we are still, populating a young field. So it's clearly we are entering unexplored territories. And I think also this symposium is a good example of how we have so different voices and different methodologies to map this, I think, huge terrain that start from the abyss of mathematical abstraction of the vector space and try, to reconstruct all the passages that from which this originated, that it is going back, to the source of life, human relation, and the subject, if not death, as part of this economy. And I think each of the contributions of this symposium have been, cutting or actually illuminating in a very original way this complex trajectory, I don't know how to call it, this dimension, this complex vector. And I think indeed, I think also what Pierre was saying, Pierre Schwartz, when he was trying to compare the historical form and the scientific form. I mean, two important, polarities and two important aspects. But also, I think Johnny's contribution, specifically Jako's contribution, was indeed illuminating an incredible, granular, a new resolution, I would say, of this system that we didn't explore before. And I can continue, I can think of Mika's Cousin Capital, that was in itself an attempt, to find, to see how indeed the vector space is accumulating, our knowledge. But I think an important aspect not to forget is like we need also, I would say the approach of, I think still, I would say, of anthropology, of psychology of development. I think Apolline's, when she was mentioning, the contribution of Piaget in the development, of pedagogical tool to teach, scientific abstraction, the role of computer, in the education, and how the computer somehow then became somewhat complicit in the making, in the abstraction of knowledge and in new pedagogical practices. I'm just saying this because, I'm trying myself to make a synthesis and to map this very complex terrain. I see polarities, I see distances that have to be navigated.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Mika, yeah, we need the microphone. What?
I think ideally this will become a dialogue.
It's collective. It's not it's not a Politburo still. A few years.
Yeah, I think a comparison that's inevitable in this moment and this sense of novelty we have is how people were feeling about the internet and the personal computer in the 90s. And I think something we're missing right now, which we had then, was the hacker ethos. Essentially the feeling that there was like a continuity between thinking and building. And that was kind of what I was trying to get at the very end of my talk, even though it was just like kind of scratching the surface. And I think that would be, I'd be really interested what people think about that pipeline, and why actually currently it feels so impossible to do any sort of building that challenges the kind of LLM paradigm. And I feel like we're, for better or worse, stuck thinking in a way that's quite disempowering, actually.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, not to discredit thinking, but I would like to see a continuum between those two modes.
Did you want to say something before? Well, so I'm going to do, I should have compressed before I opened my mouth. I'm going to do it now. Most of what I've been thinking about is intentional overcomplication as gatekeeping. And we had this conversation during the break, and I don't remember your name. Matt, hi Matt, where I teach in the MFA department at Yale. I had a student who was doing something around machine learning, and she was explaining one of her projects, and she was like, it comes from this paper, but the paper is really complicated, so I'm not gonna waste your time explaining it. And I was like, nah, you need to actually explain it. Like, I want you to explain it. And part of the reason for that push was that I think that while machine learning is a complicated field, it is made intentionally obtuse and difficult to penetrate so that we don't penetrate it, right? And so I do think that part of what I'm really interested, coming back to these questions around papers that are all AI or these other things, is like, pedagogically, how do we approach this challenge, right? Like, how do we actually create pathways? If you are in the painting department, how do you create a pathway for people to actually make sense of machine learning? And there are strategies, but I feel like thinking about my institution, other institutions, a lot of it is research into AI versus pedagogically, how do we support students across many disciplines to develop the type of literacy that is necessary to approach and deal with these challenges versus waiting for something really crappy to happen and then having to have a reaction. So I think there is a pedagogical part that is missing, and I can't remember who did the presentation yesterday on Piaget and a lot of the education elements, but I feel like that is an area to be rounded out. And I guess the last thing I'll say is I keep thinking about the platypus. So I think the platypus is an amazing animal. And I think it's an amazing animal mostly because it is this bizarre animal that has many different parts from many different species, but somehow functions in the world while being bizarre. And I kind of think about our approach to making sense of this contemporary moment, and technology is almost taking a platypus approach of like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and we can let our seam show in the process, but it is important to sort of think about the things that we consider vestigial in one context as being very necessary now, and what does it mean to sort of create this interdisciplinary Frankenstein beast that does more than like cause trouble, but actually is sort of has a momentum that allows for us to move in ways that we wouldn't be able to move if we were sort of like confining ourselves to sort of one speciation.
In the back? Sorry.
Thank you. Kameelah, your point about hacking is really useful, I think, because it's true. I think there's, certainly among my colleagues back at where I work, I think they feel like there's no spirit to that. I suppose one of the key problems is about scales and energy, which we maybe haven't spoken about so much, but it does feel like we're tinkering around edges of something big that we can't get a hold of. But I suppose also these things that we're using at the moment, there's been a number of really great presentations to help unpack some of the history, to remind us that these things are always changing. So building up a kind of literacy now in the way that I think has been coming through in this conference is really important, even if it's not quite got that spirit of hack that you talk about. I think it's really good. I just want to say thank you to everyone because it's been a really marvelous conference. Maybe I could just quickly say a few things that I feel have come up. It's been really interesting. Wittgenstein's come up a lot, and I've enjoyed that. But I think it's been interesting. There's been quite, and I think it's sort of partly come from the Wittgenstein, certainly in some places. There's been quite a lot of mention about worlding, which again I wonder is if it's us trying to find a strategy, a place within this ourselves. I'm sure many of you will know better than me, but I feel quite convinced that the big companies that are already owning the large language models, I think they're definitely working on world models beyond what we've been talking about, I think. And I think that will be that's an important step to be ready for, actually. And then just finally, and I might be wrong about this, but because of the vector space, I think we very often use language around space, and we've talked quite a little bit about form. I haven't really heard much about time and temporality so much, which has been interesting. And just on that, as a final remark on that, there's been a number of papers that are interested in the relationship between economy and the model, for example, which I think really makes sense. But actually, that's an interesting area to bring in time, because the problem for the command economy, for example, was that it could never know the price, and there was so many efforts to try and calculate the price. And I suppose one of the things, there was a paper, I think there's been this phrase around liquidating, and I was trying to work out whether I go along with that entirely, because on the one hand, of course, with price, there is this sense of liquidity, time, change, update. But one of the problems with the language model, or the analogy there, is that there is a sense of ledger, but I think there's a more static notion of kind of the price in the large language model, as in it gets determined. Well, we've talked about patterns, and I think it's a sort of difference between liquidity and pattern that I found really interesting as well. Sorry, there were just some various comments.
Over to Johnny.
Cheers. Sorry I'm wearing sunglasses like an asshole. I just have a headache. Two things I wanted to say. One is about time. John Agar he's a historian of technology and has written about the history of AI and wrote an interesting piece about what technology is. Is there a definition that we can distill from the long history of human technologies? And he landed on a material means to an end that intervenes across scales. So a bicycle intervenes across geographical scales, a light intervenes across scales of luminosity, a fridge intervenes across thermodynamic scales. And I've long been curious about what scale does machine learning or LLMs or AI, how could we think about this tool that way? Time is one candidate in my mind for the scales, temporal scales. And I think you were talking about death. to end us on is fascinating because it forces the issue that we do not operate on that scale, or we can't. We have finite limits that are different than these systems. And at the same time, these systems, ironically, in their material form, are deeply fragile. Like, the funny thing about digital immortality for me is always like, show me a hard drive from 10 years ago, make it work, and I will have that talk with you. On the hackers piece, I wanted to push back gently, I guess, only to say that there's an interesting article in Janet Abate's and Stephanie Dick's Embodiments and Abstractions volume about hackers, and one of the things that they've written about is that, I can't remember the author, but that hackers were often middle class. They came from, like, 2 computer homes, and would use the kind of act of hacking not to change the system, but to get a job, to get noticed, and then get incorporated into the system. And I think class language around this set of complex topics that we're talking about is very important, and demythologizing or provincializing these tools and starting with people's experience, learning from them, etc. But where I do think hacking could be interesting, this is my own personal persuasion, and I mentioned it briefly this morning, but wanted to mention it again, is hacking the medium rather than the method. Because I think computing in its relatively short lifespan has indulged a want in us to perpetuate ourselves and to indulge scale, etc. And I think not like decomputerization for me is like a forcing function for a whole other set of ways of being that are closer to craft and closer to, I don't know, the flows and the pathways that one enters in when one enters into computing that we're still trying to articulate, but may always struggle to articulate because it will continue to evolve. Yeah, but thank you for a great session.
Okay, next up is Mercedes, and then Pierre, and before Michael gets the next, I'll interject something.
Yeah, I continue there. I also want to push back a little bit on the, oh no, we have no hackers. I think it's basically also us. We fortify the AI discourse that they are just the big companies that have so much power. Because it's also good for us, right? It's us against this big enemy, and so our work is important. But if you look around, there's so much open source work going on, open weight work going on. There is a lot of public AI discourse. There are a lot of public AI initiatives. I mean, I'm not a person who says this is totally positive, because like in our time in the nation is probably nothing that you really want to, support. But it is not so hard to build your own community AI and sort of try and test stuff out. So I think there to collect together maybe all the alternatives and make them more visible is also critical practice that we need to do a little more. I really liked in this conference that there was quite a strong notion of Marx and sort of weird ways of trying to bring him together with AI and LLMs, or parts of his theories, as well as Wittgenstein. And I think it's interesting that we seem to have moved on from data as a discourse, which wasn't debated much here at all, which is interesting in itself to note. And we're now like trying to get our heads around models and embeddings and tokens and vectors. And we disagree a lot, and we didn't come to a conclusion, which is very good. I mean, I think this is a really nice moment when, the concept is not clear, everybody has work to do, and it's nice because once it is clear, the dice are fallen and things are not as exciting anymore as they are in this moment. So I enjoyed that quite a lot, although I have the feeling, thinking philosophically about this, we also are we might make mathematical or computational things too easy and sort of rather think with work to work than more complex later work. And this is also challenging us, of course, and it's quite hard to keep up with what's developing and what's going. But I really enjoyed that, and I think, it was quite good. So thanks for organizing this.
Yeah. Over to you, Pierre. Yeah, it's good. Pierre, sorry. Over to Pierre.
Yeah, just something on the question of scale, or I guess temporality in some way. I mean, a lot of the antecedents of AI systems, or what it relies on, had some kind of political model, right? Or, I mean, in Leibniz, you find this idea of a social harmony through calculus, right? In the history of statistics, you find the idea that you would kind of normalize things or compare things to an average, right? And we're losing the measure in some sense with AI. We have an embrace of contingency, we have an embrace of instability, because what's being aimed at is no longer just a population or a collectivist, it's contingency itself in the context of a political economy of AI. And that changes things fundamentally, because the idea of measure implies that there's actually a norm by which we can measure things, but when that's constantly shifting, that makes it a lot harder.
Michael is next. I just kind of wanted to use the moment in which we were talking about hacking, which I find insanely problematic for the reasons Johnny mentioned, also because it's a deeply masculinist culture in many ways. And open source also has become partially a technology of capture, and I understand why hacking might have been more complex. But I would like to challenge us maybe a little bit, given the political moment, to think about also different forms of resistance, and think about what we're actually theorizing, and what to do with that theory, because I have that question on top of my mind at the moment, and so
Yeah, thanks for all the critical pushback. I mean, obviously hacking, the hackers of the 90s are today billionaires, and it's a completely recuperated, or not completely, but mostly recuperated moment of, that was maybe a weak rebellion to begin with. I think the point is more to emphasize that we need some sort of continuity between theory and building. And I think here the question of scale is really crucial. It was nice that that was brought up, because I think we're at a moment when I think, for example, we need some sort of government level interventions into having different paradigms of AI that are not the Silicon Valley paradigm. And if we look across the Atlantic, if we look at people like Alex Karp, they really understand this, but they come to it with what's essentially like a crypto-fascist perspective. And I think we need that sort of continuum between, not as a critical, uncritical repetition of the 90s, but as repetition and difference, something different that overcomes also the failures of the 90s hacking movement and takes into account what happened then. So I stick to my call that we need to build things, and I think the open models, as inspiring they are, I'm a daily user of Olama myself, but it's I feel like we're still kind of stuck in the paradigm, it's iterating on the paradigm of the frontier labs that remain non-open, that are still in the control of these tech giants that we've commented so much on the past few days.
I think, Matteo, you wanted to...
Just in terms, not theoretical effort, but more practical and political one, I can share some initiative also of our research group connected to the current news. As you know, unfortunately, Jeff Bezos is coming here to Venice to celebrate the wedding. And the city, the people, they're quite angry. And we are organizing and actually anticipating a workshop we wanted to do in autumn on digital capitalism and the problem of monopoly capital in the age of AI, in the age of high-tech monopolies. So I want to share this initiative that should be quite extemporaneous but scientific, because we want to do it within the university, open to the whole city, but having a quite scientific approach to this problem of monopoly capital and digital monopolies that is clear to everyone, so you don't need to convince anyone politically about this problem. This is connected to another kind of small symposium we want to do, hopefully in autumn, that would be about precisely positioning AI in macroeconomics, if you want to say that theoretically, but trying to map the development of technology, development of AI, not by itself, not just following a sort of, internalist cycle, but showing how, economic development is connected to a technological development, how this is related, to transformation of the labor market. And this, however, is influenced by migrations across this planet. So we have this ambition to position AI within a kind of long wave theory of capitalist development. And this is, I think, a political gesture. It's quite, I think, a political project we have regarding the autumn. Next year, we would like to continue this conversation around the critical AI. And we have another idea that's quite different, but I think we find it very important to discuss the forms of knowledge alienation today, understanding alienation not just in terms of economic alienation, not just in terms of labor alienation, not just of knowledge alienation, but understanding as mental alienation. So this complicated, actually, relation that AI has with form of rationality that implies, normative form of mental abilities and disability. But about this, let's stay in contact, because as soon as we finish, as soon as we conclude this event and the connected publication, we start scheme up in the next steps.
Can I ask a clarifying
Please?
question? You and sunglasses, I'm sorry, I don't remember your names. Yes, Johnny. You said hack the medium, not the method. Could you say more about that? Or, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to respond to something I didn't get to say to you before. First of all, Matteo, everything you just said, that sounds really great. I hope you don't mind me sharing this. Jakob said when we were flying in here yesterday, he said, I think this is going to be a historic conference. I think people will look back and look at this as quite an important meeting. So I hope you continue it. I also, because I didn't get to participate in the earlier days, just to help build this community, if there was a way to see, if everybody could post in a Google Doc, like papers that you've written that we should read, I would really appreciate that, because I want to know what you're doing, and that would help maybe cement us a bit more. I was going to say, George Orwell has the idea of a dead metaphor, that like language dies, atrophies. It doesn't mean, when we talk about like the final nail in the coffin, that meant a lot more when you were like seeing coffins being built day to day, and you had like, it was a shortcut to an emotional reaction that in this day and age you wouldn't have unless you, and so I think keeping metaphors alive is important. In terms of resistance, I appreciate the response from the gentleman about hacking. I didn't mean to derail hacking. We agree in the spirit of what we're trying to converge on. And when I said interrupt the medium, not the method, I don't know, like there are some priors that enter our conversation that history can relieve us of, or at least make unfamiliar, that I think we ought to explore in what might become an age of mysticism again. The idea that time is linear, relatively new. The time that we steer towards upward progress in material terms, relatively new. And, so I guess what I'm saying, to answer your question, I'm not convinced that computing will be a part of our future, because it's actually not a very reliable medium yet. It's ubiquitous, and there's a lot of money, and it will change, but it's, we saw during COVID with trying to get a car, if a Tesla door has 6 microprocessors in it and you can't get all of them, you don't get the car. So I'm like shorting, I guess, to use a financial term, the idea that it's going to be digital. But I think we need to dignify, in my view, decomputerization, and that all the ways we don't use computing purposefully in our world, and maybe not use that word if it's too negative. But then, final thing I was going to say was, so riffing on what hacking could be in this moment. If LLMs are a product of what is effectively the largest theft of intellectual property in history, how could we steal them back? Like, we're collectively pretty good at stealing. I bet we could figure out how to do something there. I also think malicious compliance is a nice tool. And when you were giving your talk and giving us all the different ways that dead people are living on, I was like, what does a cultural or social or political DDoS attack look like, where like you send off your legacy as a kind of FU to... Okay, I'm ratcheting it up, but I think that's it's interesting to think about living, exciting ways that can excite hope in people of like, yeah, wait a minute, we have more power than they do, and soon, because I worry that actually we are living through a closing door period in which you will be spotted and pulled out immediately for the wrong things in the future. That's my worry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just collecting some thoughts from Mike, but also from the last talk. Thank you. The word, it's a lot of word flowing, but I was wondering if still a political category common after commonality, communion, community, if also as a political gesture, common is still the political category into which rooting some also kind of in between theory and practice experience such as this. And the other things maybe I was just putting there, like from my personal experience, like maybe what is missing in this, informing this like general intellect is maybe a southern perspective, like also in terms of technology. Like this is really North US technology. So how to deconstruct also this in terms of, the practical tools, like I think it's really important to overlap somehow. Also, Venice can be exactly the place, as Matteo was at the very beginning of the first day saying, between East and West. So thank you for all the thoughts.
Okay, I think we can.
I think if there are no further comments, I was going to say we'll continue over drinks, which might, also, I don't know, give us life back, and we can just continue the discussion.
Helps to find some conclusions. Okay, now.